Recently, in popular culture, the British comedian Russell Brand made headlines for going on a rant about the pointlessness of voting. He said he had never voted, he refused to vote, not because he was opposed to it in concept, but because he believed the system was so decrepit, so corrupt, and so broken that to vote was to only enable people who would continue to not solve the problems. A pretty extreme position. One certainly we might see in our undergraduates as they become recently aware of their position. But the South and voting has a very interesting legacy that I wonder if you could talk about and help us understand why are we at a point where people are finding Russell Brand's idea appealing because they don't believe their vote matters?
I think that's, but it goes way back. I remember when Carter was running against Reagan, and most of my colleagues said, well, it just doesn't matter. I'm going to vote for, and I was in Illinois where Anderson was from, and I'm going to vote for it. It doesn't matter. And I wrote this article and put it out about the importance, if nothing else, of the courts. And not just the Supreme Court, but all the federal judges in terms of these rulings. I got poo-pooed a lot by my colleague, but I pulled that out several times and shown it to them since, and it really, there you can see it, but it's a lot more than that, where voting matters. I mean, we haven't talked much about the courts, but that's important too, and it's become increasingly important, a lot more important, I would suspect, than perhaps even in the 19th century now, as the sort of final arbiter of what our laws are and what you can do and not do. And so that is tied, people don't realize how closely that's tied to their own vote and who their representatives are in terms of the issues that they care about. But I do think I've been involved in a lot of the voting rights as an expert witness for minority plaintiffs. And of course, there's a lot of criticism about redistricting, which I would argue is the partisan redistricting that uses the Voting Rights Act, not the Voting Rights Act itself, that has helped draw these extreme districts that have sort of added to the problem. But it's an old problem in American history. It's gone back further than we realize, but with the introduction of the technology, like the computer, where anybody can have on their desktop the maps that they can move one person across into another precinct, into another district, so they can ensure an election of a certain party or person, has added some complications to this. I think all that has gotten people pretty jaded about the process of politics, let alone the results of these extreme districts where people, as I thought David was showing very nicely yesterday, how all these people saw themselves in the middle, as these presidents as mainline middle, seeing themselves in the middle of American politics. People see themselves now on the extremes as a way to actually advertise themselves. It's much more of a celebrity culture as well. We can go on for voting forever on the South and voting. I thought David did a really important job of showing how Truman saw that he could win without the Democratic South. And then, of course, the reversal of the Republican Party, seeing how they could pick up the solid Republican South in a few other states. Just how critical the states are. The red-blue have almost become a southern northern.
There's a funny story about Virginia Durr, who's a civil rights activist, a white civil rights activist, moving with her husband to Northern Virginia during the beginning of World War II. And she wanted to register to vote in Fairfax County, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. So she figures, well, go to the county courthouse and do it. But no, they didn't have the books. The registrar kept the books at his home. She went to his home, and he couldn't find them. So he asked her to come back, and she came back and said, well, I finally found them. And he gets out these old, decrepit books. So he writes her name in the book, and she's registered to vote. Well, she goes to the poll on election day to vote. And I'm sorry, Ms. Durr, but you can't vote. So what do you mean? I registered, and you know, I signed the book and everything. He said, well, yeah, we have that information here, but you haven't paid your poll tax. yet. So she said, well, how about if I run to the courthouse now and pay my poll tax? I'll get a receipt to show you. He said, well, yeah, you can try that, but then get back here in time. Well, she tried that, and they said, well, wait a second. You not only have to pay your poll tax this year, but all the previous years you were here. Well, to make a long story short, she didn't vote in that election. But that's how difficult it was for a white person to register and vote in Virginia. So you can imagine the difficulties. And now with this redistricting, only about 14% of congressional seats are competitive, which means, of course, that Democrats and Republicans have a fairly equal chance of being elected. So with that, I mean, why bother to vote? But the thing is that votes do matter. Our elections, at least the past 6 presidential elections, have been very close. And because we have an electoral college system, if in a state a candidate wins by 1 vote, that candidate gets the entire state's electoral votes, with the exception of Nebraska and New Hampshire. So it's very vital to understand that each vote counts. And I agree with Vernon, particularly sometimes we tend to forget that presidents also have the power to appoint federal judges, not only Supreme Court, right, but throughout the federal judiciary, and they are really key. I think one of the most important aspects of the civil rights movement were the appointments that Eisenhower made to the federal bench, the Supreme Court, and the federal circuit and district courts as well.
I think, and it was like when Jesse Jackson ran, I often did statistical analysis as well for the minority candidates. There were always anomalies. Barack Obama is African American. There's a special interest. But when it's not a minority candidate running, there's still going to be support there, but it will, at least historically, you can show it will not be at the kind of levels that allow the Democrats to win. I think that's when it's going to really matter, really tremendously in terms of, and something we haven't talked about is we celebrate people like John Lewis and these black congressmen and others that's been possible because of the Voting Rights Act. That is, we brought people in to the table for discussions. So many times it has not been that people deliberately discriminated. They were unaware of the issues of people. Again and again, for small towns and cities, I would discover it wasn't that the council was trying to discriminate against the black men. They all lived within 15 houses of each other on the same streets and went to the same church. They were unaware that there was, not curbs in the black neighborhoods. That sounds strange, but I honestly believe it. It wasn't deliberate. When you had then elected the minority, when you went to districts, were able to elect a minority, and they came to the table, then that voice was there and could be considered, even if it was just one person, let alone, maybe 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 5. But having those voices at the table are very important.